A director so disgusted with what the studio did to his movie, he took his name off it. A film that got absolutely demolished by a kids' movie about a friendly alien. And a space vampire epic so completely unhinged that the people who made it still can't fully explain what they were going for. These are 11 sci-fi movies from the 1980s that crashed and burned at the box office, got buried by critics, and then somehow, against all logic and reason, crawled back out of the ground and became some of the most beloved films of the entire decade. Hi, my name is Mark, and welcome to Old Sci-Fi Movies. 1. Blade Runner, 1982. Ridley Scott came off the back of Alien, which was a massive hit, and went straight into what is now considered one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. And when Blade Runner opened in June of 1982, audiences looked at it and said, no thanks. The film cost somewhere around $28 million to make, and pulled in just over $14 million domestically in its initial run. That's not a misfire, that's a full collapse. And the reasons are actually pretty fascinating when you look back at them now. Audiences in the summer of 1982 were not in the mood for a slow, rain-soaked philosophical meditation on what it means to be human. They wanted E.T., they wanted fun, they wanted something that felt good. Blade Runner felt like a headache. Critics were split right down the middle. Some called it visually stunning, but emotionally cold. Others were outright hostile. One reviewer called it a beautiful empty box. Harrison Ford was miserable during production. He and Scott clashed constantly, and Ford has been pretty candid over the years about the fact that he was not enjoying himself on that set. The infamous voiceover narration that got added to the original theatrical cut, which Ford himself has called one of the worst things ever added to one of his films, and he said it in much more colorful language than that, was a direct result of test screenings that left studio executives terrified that audiences weren't following the story. So they forced a narration onto it. Ford deliberately read his lines as flatly and lifelessly as possible, hoping they'd scrap it. They didn't. And then there's the ending. The studio tacked on a happy ending using leftover footage from The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's film, not a Blade Runner sequel. Owen, just to be clear, and Scott has never let anyone forget how much he hated that decision. But then something happened. The film hit home video, and people started watching it again, and the questions it was asking about memory, identity, mortality, what separates a human being from something that merely acts like one. Those questions started to land differently outside of a summer blockbuster context. By the time Ridley Scott released his director's cut in 1992 and then the final cut in 2007, the critical consensus had completely reversed. It's now regularly listed among the greatest films ever made. Full stop, not just greatest sci-fi films. Greatest films, period. Roger Ebert eventually called it one of the great visionary films. The box office failure is now just a footnote. 2. The Thing, 1982. Here's a sentence I want you to really sit with for a second. In the summer of 1982, John Carpenter released what many people now consider the greatest sci-fi horror film ever made, and audiences rejected it so completely that it effectively ended his run as a major Hollywood director. And the movie that beat it was about a friendly alien who liked candy and wanted to go home. E.T., the extraterrestrial, and The Thing came out within 2 weeks of each other in June of 1982. E.T. was warm and hopeful and made everyone cry happy tears. The Thing was paranoid and cold and made everyone deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Spielberg's film won. It wasn't close. The Thing cost $15 million to make and barely scraped together $19 million at the domestic box office. That sounds like it broke even until you factor in marketing and distribution costs, at which point it was very much in the red. Critics were savage. The New York Times called it a wretched excess. Pauline Kael, one of the most influential critics of that era, described it as one of the most derivative and despairing films she'd seen in years. What Carpenter was going for was something genuinely terrifying on a psychological level. The setup, a shape-shifting alien that can perfectly imitate any living creature infiltrating a remote Antarctic research station, is built entirely around paranoia and mistrust. You can never be sure who is still human and who isn't. Carpenter wanted audiences to feel that uncertainty in their bones, and they did. They just didn't enjoy feeling it. Rob Bottin's practical special effects work on this film is, to this day, absolutely jaw-dropping. The creature transformations, the chest cavity scene, all of it was done practically, physically, with no computers, and it still holds up against anything made in the last 40 years. The Academy famously didn't even nominate it for special effects, because the effects branch considered it too gross for a special effects award. You cannot make that up. It took years, but the thing built its cult one viewer at a time, mostly through word of mouth and repeated VHS rentals. Carpenter has been pretty gracious about it in interviews. He said he was devastated at the time, but that finding out the film had eventually become so beloved was one of the great consolations of his career. Tron, 1982. 1982 really was a spectacular year for movies that audiences didn't want and then later decided they loved. We've already got 2 entries from that year, and here comes a third one. Tron is fascinating because the story of how it got made is almost as interesting as the film itself. Disney was in a rough stretch in the early 1980s. The animation department was struggling, the live-action films weren't clicking, and then along comes a young director named Steven Lisberger with this completely insane idea about a computer programmer who gets digitized and sucked inside a computer and has to fight for his survival in a world made entirely of light cycles and deadly frisbees. The film cost $17 million to make, which was a significant investment for Disney at the time. And it pulled in about $33 million worldwide, so technically it made money. But the expectations were much higher, the marketing had positioned it as the next Star Wars, and the actual box office performance was seen as a major disappointment. Disney essentially shelved plans for sequels and merchandise, and moved on. Here's the part that still gets people angry though. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences disqualified Tron from consideration for Best Visual Effects, because the visual effects branch ruled that using computers to create effects was considered cheating. They thought using computers in a movie about computers was cheating. I genuinely love that this happened in the real world and not in a comedy sketch. The film did something that almost no movie in history had done before it. It used computer-generated imagery as a central visual component. The light cycle sequences, the game grid, the whole digital world Lisberger built. It was unprecedented. The technology was so new and so strange that audiences just didn't quite know what to make of it. But then home video happened again. Kids grew up watching Tron on tape, on cable, on whatever screen they could find it on. And by the time Disney finally greenlit a sequel, Tron Legacy in 2010, the original had been a cult classic for nearly 3 decades. Jeff Bridges, who starred in the original, has always been warm about it. He said the film was ahead of its time in ways that nobody fully understood when it came out.
Propelled into the digital world of the computer.
4. Flash Gordon, 1980. Alright, I'm just gonna say this up front. Flash Gordon, this is objectively ridiculous. The costumes are ridiculous. The sets are ridiculous. Brian Blessed is in it screaming at full volume for about 90% of his screen time. And the soundtrack is by Queen. The whole thing is completely, gloriously, unapologetically out of its mind. And I love every second of it. The film came out in December of 1980 and cost about $35 million to produce. It made about $27 million in the United States, which sounds almost okay, until you realize that the studio had positioned this as a massive blockbuster franchise starter in the vein of Star Wars. On those terms, it was a genuine disaster. Critics were not kind. The consensus at the time was that the film was campy in a way that felt lazy rather than deliberate, that it was too self-aware to work as genuine adventure, and not clever enough to work as satire. Some reviewers thought it was embarrassing. Producer Dino De Laurentiis had spent years trying to get this project off the ground, and the critical reception was a real gut punch. But here's where it gets interesting. The people who made Flash Gordon were completely aware of what kind of movie they were making. Director Mike Hodges, who had made the brilliant and very serious British crime film Get Carter, leaned into the absurdity fully and intentionally. and Queen, who composed the entire score, matched that energy beat for beat. Freddie Mercury reportedly watched footage of the film being edited and wrote music to match specific scenes. The result is one of the most joyfully excessive soundtracks in movie history. The film found its audience on television and home video through the 1980s and 90s, where its deliberate campiness stopped feeling like a flaw and started feeling like the whole point. Tarantino has cited it as an influence. Entire generations of people have entire scenes memorized. Flash. Savior of the universe. You know it. You're humming it right now. Don't pretend you're not. 5. Dune, 1984. I'm going to be honest with you about something. I have a complicated relationship with David Lynch's Dune. Every few years I sit down to watch it and I have the same experience. 30 minutes of absolute bewilderment, then a strange kind of surrender, then something approaching genuine fascination, then complete confusion again at the ending. Every time, like clockwork. And I think that experience is actually pretty close to what everyone had in theaters in December of 1984. Frank Herbert's novel is one of the most complex and beloved science fiction works ever written. A sprawling epic of politics, religion, ecology, and power set across multiple planets and factions. David Lynch, who had just made the surrealist masterpiece Eraserhead and the critically acclaimed The Elephant Man, was brought in to adapt it. On paper, you could almost see the logic. Almost. The film cost $40 to $45 million to produce, estimates vary, and made roughly $30 million worldwide. It was a significant financial disaster for Universal and producer Dino De Laurentiis, who also produced Flash Gordon. Which means Dino had an impressively rough decade and honestly deserves a whole separate video. Lynch has been extremely public about his feelings regarding what happened. The studio had final cut approval, not Lynch, and the version that ended up in theaters was not the version he envisioned. He has since largely disowned the film, refused to discuss it in interviews beyond brief dismissals, and asked that his name be removed from the television cut, which ran even longer and which he had absolutely nothing to do with. The television version is credited to a fictional director named Alan Smithee, which was a standard industry pseudonym used when directors wanted to disown a project. And yet, the film built an audience. Not immediately, and not without considerable confusion along the way, but it built one. The production design is genuinely extraordinary. The costumes, the world building, the sheer visual ambition of what Lynch and his team created is undeniable. Kyle MacLachlan in his film debut is excellent, and Toto's score is, quietly, one of the most underrated soundtracks of the decade. Denis Villeneuve, who directed the acclaimed two-part remake starting in 2021, has spoken about how the Lynch version affected him when he saw it as a young man. He found it fascinating even where it failed. That's a pretty good summary of how a lot of people feel about it.
We're a young warrior.
6. The Black Hole, 1979/1980. Okay, quick pause. I know, technically, The Black Hole was released in December of 1979, which puts it right on the edge of our 1980s window. But it released in most international markets through 1980. Its cultural footprint lands squarely in the early 80s era, and frankly, it's my list, and I'm including it. Moving on. Disney made The Black Hole for $20 million off the back of Star Wars fever, hoping to capture some of that same audience. The film features a massive spaceship, a deranged scientist, a pair of cute robots, and a black hole that the villain plans to fly directly into because he has decided this is a good idea. The film ends with what can only be described as a fever dream theological sequence that was almost certainly not what most children who sat down expecting a fun space adventure were prepared for. The Black Hole made approximately $25 million domestically and was considered a box office disappointment. More importantly, it confused pretty much everyone who saw it. Kids were expecting something closer to Star Wars. What they got was a genuinely strange, tonally inconsistent film that started as a family adventure and ended with what appears to be a vision of hell. Parents were baffled, critics were mixed at best. But that tonal weirdness is exactly why people came back to it. The black hole takes itself seriously in a way that makes it genuinely interesting to revisit as an adult. Maximilian, the menacing red robot villain, is a legitimately unsettling screen presence. The production design is lush and detailed, and that ending, whatever it is, sticks with you. Filmmakers have cited it as an influence precisely because it was willing to go somewhere darker and stranger than almost any other family-aimed sci-fi film of that era would dare.
I've created companions of a sort.
7. Honest Creel, 1983. Krull is the kind of movie that, if you saw it between the ages of 6 and 12, is permanently lodged in your brain in a way that's completely disproportionate to its actual quality. And I say that as someone who saw it at age 8 and still occasionally thinks about the glaive. Columbia Pictures spent around $47 million making Krull, which in 1983 was an absolutely enormous sum. The film made about $16 million domestically. That is not a gap that closes. That is a gap that ends careers and causes studio executives to have very unpleasant conversations. The premise is a mashup of fantasy and science fiction that the studio couldn't quite figure out how to market. You've got a medieval kingdom, a prince, a princess, a prophecy, a band of outlaws, and also an alien invasion force called the Slayers, who are operating out of a fortress that teleports to a new location every day at dawn. It's a lot. The film throws a lot of things at the wall, and some of them stick, and some of them definitely don't.
Very fat, very
Director Peter Yates, who had made the excellent crime thriller Bullet, was an interesting choice for this kind of material, and the results are exactly as uneven as you'd expect. But here's the thing about Krull that defenders of the film always bring up and that they're right about. James Horner's score is extraordinary. It's sweeping and epic and emotional in a way that genuinely elevates the material around it. Horner went on to score Aliens, Braveheart, Titanic, and Avatar, and you can hear the seeds of all of that in what he did for Krull. And the film's cult following is intensely loyal in a way that's hard to explain to someone who didn't grow up with it. Liam Neeson and Robbie Coltrane both appear in early roles, which gives it an interesting retrospective quality. And the practical effects work on the glaive, the 5-pointed throwing weapon that the hero wields, holds up surprisingly well. It's a mess, but it's an ambitious, earnest, lovable mess, and that counts for something.
a fighter. Recite.
8. Life Force. Yasan 1985. I have to be careful about how I describe Life Force because there's really no way to do it that doesn't sound like I'm making things up. So let me just state the facts plainly. Life Force is a 1985 science fiction horror film, directed by Tobe Hooper, based on a novel called The Space Vampires, in which a British space mission discovers a derelict alien spacecraft near Halley's Comet containing 3 humanoid aliens in suspended animation. They bring them back to Earth. The female alien wakes up and promptly starts draining the life energy from everyone she encounters while walking through the entire film without any clothing on. This eventually triggers a zombie apocalypse in London. There is also a subplot involving Patrick Stewart. The film cost $25 million to produce and made around $11 million worldwide. Critics were not particularly interested in engaging with it on any level beyond mild bewilderment. It was seen as excessive, incoherent, and gleefully tasteless, which, to be fair, is a completely accurate description. But here's what the critics mostly missed. Tobe Hooper, who made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the original Poltergeist, was operating at a very specific frequency with Life Force, one that was directly influenced by the British Hammer horror films he grew up loving. The film has the heightened, lurid, operatic quality of those 1960s and 70s Hammer productions. It's not trying to be subtle, and it never pretends otherwise for a single frame of its running time. Henry Mancini's score is genuinely great. The production design is ambitious. Steve Railsback in the lead gives a committed and genuinely strange performance. And the sheer audacity of the whole enterprise, the scope of it, the complete refusal to dial anything back even slightly, gives it a quality that grows more entertaining with every viewing. Cannon Films, the production company behind it, made a lot of movies in the 1980s. Life Force is almost certainly the strangest and most interesting thing they ever produced. Nine. Enemy Mine, 1985. Enemy Mine might be the entry on this list that I feel most strongly about, and I think it's also the one that deserves the most serious reconsideration from people who dismissed it the first time around. The premise is deceptively simple. A human fighter pilot and an alien warrior from an enemy species crash land on a hostile planet and have to figure out how to survive together. What starts as mutual hostility gradually becomes something much more complicated. A genuine friendship, a profound connection across what seems like an unbridgeable divide. The film cost $40 million to make and pulled in around $12 million worldwide. By any measure, that was a catastrophe, and the production had been troubled almost from the beginning. The movie was originally supposed to be shot in Iceland under director Richard Lon Crane. After extensive production work, the studio decided the footage wasn't working, replaced Lon Crane with Wolfgang Petersen, who had just made Das Boot, and rebuilt the entire alien planet on a soundstage in Munich. The budget ballooned, the delays piled up. By the time the film actually reached theaters in December of 1985, the marketing was minimal, and the studio's enthusiasm was approximately zero, which is a shame, because the film that Petersen made is genuinely moving in a way that a lot of sci-fi films of that era simply weren't trying to be. Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr., who plays the alien Drac under extraordinary prosthetic makeup, are both excellent. Gossett especially. The physicality and warmth he brings to a role that required him to perform under hours of makeup every day is remarkable. The film's willingness to take its themes of empathy and connection seriously without irony, without winking at the audience, gives it a quality that has aged extremely well.
Get in or don't you get the English, huh? I don't love you and you don't love me.
10. Explorers, 1985. 1985 was apparently the year Hollywood decided to release every interesting sci-fi film with no marketing support, and then act surprised when they didn't make money. We've already seen Enemy Mine. Here's another one. Explorers was directed by Joe Dante, who had just come off Gremlins, which was one of the biggest hits of 1984. The studio saw his name attached. Awe saw a story about kids building a homemade spaceship and making first contact with aliens, and rushed the film into production and straight to theaters before Dante had finished it. He has said in interviews that the film was not complete when it was released, that there were scenes he hadn't shot yet, effects that weren't finished, story elements that weren't resolved. The studio didn't care. They wanted the movie in theaters. The result is a film that feels slightly uneven in its second half, in a way that is entirely explained by the circumstances of its release. The first half of Explorers is genuinely wonderful, curious, warm, imaginative, with a real love for the kind of kids who read science fiction paperbacks and dream about what's out there. The alien contact sequence that takes up much of the third act is deliberately weird and deliberately comedic in a way that divided audiences who were expecting something more Spielberg adjacent. Here's the footnote that gives the film an almost melancholy resonance in retrospect. The two young leads were played by Ethan Hawke in his film debut and River Phoenix. Both would go on to have significant careers. Hawke famously so, Phoenix tragically cut short. Watching them together in Explorers, clearly talented kids with real chemistry, is one of those movie experiences that's almost impossible to separate from everything that came after. Dante remains frustrated that the film was released in the state it was, but the audience that found it on cable and VHS loved it completely, rough edges and all. 11. The Ice Pirates, 1984.
Good man, like Jason, space pirate, and explorer.
The premise is essentially Star Wars reimagined as a low-budget comedy western set in a future where water is the most precious resource in the galaxy, controlled by a despotic empire and traded by a ragtag group of pirates who steal ice from passing spacecraft. Yes, ice pirates. That is the premise, and the film commits to it with a completely straight face, which somehow makes it funnier. The The film cost $9 million to produce and made approximately $12 million at the box office, which means it technically turned a small profit, which makes it arguably the most financially successful film on this list in relative terms. And yet nobody at MGM seemed to think that was worth following up on, and the film disappeared from serious discussion almost immediately after release. Then Robert Urich leads the cast with the kind of effortless charm that made him such a reliable television presence throughout the 1980s. Mary Crosby, Angelica Houston in an early role, and Ron Perlman, also in an early role, round out a cast that is clearly having an enormous amount of fun. The film knows exactly what it is, and is completely at peace with that knowledge. The time warp sequence near the end of the film, in which the characters age at a rapidly accelerating rate during a chase scene, is the kind of set piece that only works when everyone involved is fully committed to the absurdity. And everyone involved absolutely is. It's the sequence that people who saw this film as children remember most vividly, usually with a huge grin on their face. Critics at the time called it a minor and disposable comedy. Ace, and maybe it is. But here's the thing about minor and disposable. Sometimes that's exactly what you want, and when something delivers exactly what it promises with genuine enthusiasm and a sense of humor about itself, that's not nothing. That's actually pretty hard to do, and that's our 11. 11 movies that the box office rejected, that critics dismissed, that studios quietly walked away from, and that audiences decided on their own schedule, on their own terms, were worth keeping around. That's the thing nobody tells you about flops. The audience gets the final vote, and sometimes the audience takes its time. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you, seriously. Drop a comment and tell me which one of these you grew up watching. Oh, because I know for a fact that at least one of these is burned into somebody's memory in a way they can't fully explain, and I want to hear about it. Hit subscribe if you're new here. The channel is called Old Sci-Fi Movies, and this is exactly what we do every single week. I'm Mark. See you in the next one.